Hi everyone. I am connecting from the outdoors today with our lovely puppy Teddy. And I wanted to talk a little bit about cheap dopamine. I love this term. I heard it recently, and it made so much sense for me. And the reason I wanted to share a little bit about this is I'm hopeful that by talking about it, perhaps some of you can take a look at your cheap sources of dopamine and sort of decide if you want to challenge some of them. So I think life is all about challenging ourselves to be a better version of us. But to track back a little bit, so dopamine, it's probably a familiar term by now to most of you. It is a chemical that we produce in our brain. And when we produce it, it's connected to the pleasure center of the brain. And it lights up our reward center, which sends us a message, this is great, and I'm gaining something from this. And dopamine's also responsible for motivation. So when it feels good, when it feels rewarding, we're motivated to continue to do that activity time and time again because there's sort of an anticipated result. That was a bit of a mouthful. But cheap dopamine is really associated with instant gratification. And we live in a world now where a lot of the activities, a lot of the sources of pleasure are designed to be instant. And instant gratification are essentially quick and easy outlets where we don't have to focus too much effort, and we certainly don't have to invest too much of ourselves, time, or energy in order to benefit from it. Now, instant gratification can be detrimental because it rewires our brain to focus on short-term outcomes, short-term effects, short-term pleasure, and it actually conditions us to avoid long-term planning because it just feels so far out of reach, and the brain then starts to work extremely fast. So, cheap dopamine. Some really great examples of cheap dopamine fall in the realm of a behavioral addiction. So gambling. Most forms of gambling are designed to give you quick, easy outcomes and a large burst of dopamine. Any sort of spending is quick bursts of dopamine. Alcohol, substances can be as well as binge watching shows, doom scrolling on devices, video games. So these are all designed to produce dopamine in the brain very quickly. Now, some other forms of cheap dopamine which I found interesting are gossiping. And that's because gossiping in the moment can feel exciting, but a lot of times after, people are left with a bit of the ick or some regret of, why did I ask about that situation? Or now I feel bad about myself because blah, blah, blah. So gossip is a source of cheap dopamine and something to look out for. Junk food. Watched a really interesting video on rats the other day. Rats have very similar brains as we do as humans. They're also studied often for addiction and sugar and behaviors like that. But they showed that, rats with healthier brains and good curriculum schedules were more effective in finding the cheese or getting through the maze than those that have ingested sugar. And sugar actually can scramble the brain and make it difficult for that rat to find the cheese, problem solve, have clear thinking, and strategize. Just a bit of a side tangent. What's really interesting is anger is a source of cheap dopamine as well. So some people get such an adrenaline rush. People that have mental health or addiction issues sometimes hook into anger easily because they're going into hyperarousal, and it's really difficult to tell between excitement and anxiety in the brain. Cheap dopamine is also detrimental because it just creates a series of poor coping strategies. So it's our quick go-to. We get these fleeting short-term effects of, okay, that felt good for a short period of time, but now I sort of need another fix. I need to make another post. I need to receive likes. I need to continue to video game. So it's never truly that rewarding, and that's the problem with cheap dopamine. Now, what happens over time is this can eventually lead to addictive behaviors. It can rewire our brain so it's difficult to focus. In fact, I work with a lot of people that have tech dependency issues, and more oftentimes than not, they can be misdiagnosed with ADHD, and that's because the brain fires similar to people with ADHD when there is a tech dependency. And so cheap dopamine also really encourages isolation and disconnection, because more oftentimes people don't approve of the behaviors, or it's just something that people are doing in secrecy or in isolation. And then it also conditions us to have a really difficult time and low motivation for long-term planning. So the future begins to feel out of reach. And if you sort of identify with addiction, poor coping, reduced focus, procrastination, isolation, I think it is important that you look at the cheap methods of dopamine that you're engaging with. And really, a coping strategy for cheap dopamine, instant gratification, is delayed gratification. So the more that you can want to use your phone and delay using your phone and try to engage in something else, the better. Your brain will start to balance out and rewire to start to welcome a delayed response. And a really good example of delayed gratification can oftentimes be traveling. So it's very rare that somebody just drives to the airport, chooses a flight, and goes, right? That would be instant gratification. Delayed gratification is thinking about going on a trip, saving for a trip, planning some activities within that trip, driving to the airport, getting on a plane, as an example, arriving at a destination. And in that moment that you arrive, you're producing so much healthy dopamine that that's actually a long-term feeling. In fact, some of you might be thinking of the last trip that you took that was meaningful to you, and you can easily access that feeling of dopamine, that feeling of joy or connection or exploring a new place in the world. And so that is an example of delayed gratification. And it sounds simple. It may be simple. And so it's a great coping strategy to try to focus on. Delay picking up the device, delay placing that bet, delay purchasing that thing in your Amazon cart. For some people, remove the problematic app if you can. For a few hours, for a few days, for a few weeks, even better. You can get it out of your system. And so I just wanted to sort of talk a little bit about that today. And I hope that everybody's enjoying the nice weather and you can get outside, even if it's for a brief period of time, like me. Okay, that's all for now.